A dead woman's name hangs around a living child's throat. Ethan Hale thought he'd buried his wife Lila 3 years ago beneath Oregon soil, thought the forest had stopped speaking her secrets. But when he finds 9-year-old Maren trembling in the mist-drenched woods, barefoot and clutching a necklace engraved with Lila's name, the past claws its way back. The girl whispers impossible words. "She told me to find you." Some ghosts don't stay buried. They send messengers. Subscribe now to uncover what the forest remembers. The trees knew things that men tried to forget. Ethan Hale understood this as he stepped deeper into the fog-soaked forest outside Ashford, his boots pressing into moss that swallowed sound like secrets. The pines rose around him, ancient sentinels with bark scarred by decades of wind and rain, their branches reaching toward a sky he could no longer see. Mist curled between the trunks like the breath of something alive, something patient. He had come here seeking silence, the kind that didn't echo with Lila's laughter or the memory of her hands threading through his hair. 3 years since the funeral. 3 years since he'd stood at her grave with dirt under his fingernails and an emptiness in his chest that no amount of whiskey or work could fill. The forest had become his cathedral, his confessional, the only place where grief felt clean instead of suffocating. He moved without direction, guided only by the familiar pull of the land beneath his feet. The scent of damp earth and cedar wrapped around him, grounding him in the present even as his mind drifted backward. Ethan had been a carpenter once, a builder of homes and furniture, a man whose hands shaped wood into something useful and beautiful. Now he built nothing but solitude, carving out a life in the margins of Ashford where people knew better than to ask questions. His cabin sat at the forest's edge, a structure of rough-hewn logs and windows that faced the trees instead of the town. He preferred the company of shadows and birdsong to the pitying glances of neighbors who still remembered Lila's bright smile and the way she'd lit up every room she entered. Out here, among the pines and the silence, he could breathe without the weight of their sympathy crushing his lungs. The fog thickened as he walked, obscuring the path ahead until he could barely see 10 feet in any direction. It wasn't unusual for the Oregon woods to swallow visibility like this, especially in late autumn when the moisture hung heavy in the air, but something felt different today. A charge in the atmosphere that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Ethan paused, listening. The forest had gone quiet, the usual chorus of rustling leaves and distant bird calls replaced by an eerie stillness. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He'd learned to trust these instincts over the years, the way the wilderness spoke in absences and shifts of energy. Something was wrong, or something was waiting. He couldn't tell which. A sound broke through the silence, faint, fragile, almost swallowed by the mist. A whimper, or perhaps a sob. Ethan's pulse quickened as he turned toward the source, his boots crunching over fallen branches. The sound came again, clearer this time, unmistakably human, a child's voice, trembling with fear and exhaustion. He quickened his pace, pushing through a thicket of ferns that soaked his jeans with cold dew. The fog seemed to part reluctantly, revealing glimpses of pale skin and tangled hair before closing in again. His heart hammered against his ribs, adrenaline cutting through the fog of his own emotional numbness. He hadn't expected to find anyone out here, certainly not a child alone in the wilderness, where black bears roamed and temperatures dropped below freezing at night. Then he saw her, a small figure huddled at the base of an ancient Douglas fir, her knees drawn to her chest, her face buried in her arms. She wore a thin cotton dress, torn and stained with mud and pine needles, no jacket, despite the cold that turned her lips faintly blue. Her feet were bare, scratched and bleeding from the forest floor. Ethan approached slowly, careful not to startle her, his voice low and steady when he spoke. "Hey there. It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The girl's head snapped up, her eyes wide and glassy with terror and something else, recognition perhaps, or hope. She couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years old, with dark hair that clung to her cheeks and a face that seemed too old for her age, etched with shadows that didn't belong to childhood. She stared at him as if trying to decide whether he was real or another trick of the forest. Ethan crouched down to her level, keeping his movements slow and unthreatening. "My name's Ethan. What's yours?" The girl's lips trembled, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She opened her mouth, closed it, then whispered so quietly he almost didn't catch it. "Maren." The name hung in the air between them, fragile as spider silk. Ethan nodded, offering her the gentlest smile he could manage, though his mind was already racing with questions. How long had she been out here? Where were her parents? What had happened to leave her alone and terrified in the heart of the wilderness? But he pushed those questions aside for now, focusing only on the immediate need to get her warm and safe. He shrugged off his flannel jacket and wrapped it around her small shoulders, the fabric swallowing her frame. "Maren, we need to get you out of here. Can you walk?" She shook her head, her eyes never leaving his face, and in that moment, Ethan felt something shift inside him, a responsibility he hadn't carried in years, a purpose beyond his own grief. Ethan scooped Maren into his arms, surprised by how light she was, how fragile her body felt against his chest. She didn't resist. Instead, curling into him with a desperation that spoke of hours or perhaps days spent alone in the cold. Her small hands gripped his shirt, her face pressing against his shoulder as if she could burrow into the warmth of another human being. He could feel her heart racing, a rapid flutter like a trapped bird, and the dampness of tears soaking through the fabric of his shirt. The fog seemed to close in tighter around them as he began walking, retracing his steps toward the nearest trailhead. The forest, that had felt familiar moments before now, took on an alien quality, the trees looming like silent witnesses to something unspeakable. Ethan's mind churned with possibilities, none of them good. Missing child cases didn't end well in these woods. He'd heard the stories. Hikers who vanished, children who wandered off and were never found, the wilderness that swallowed people whole and offered no answers. Maren shivered against him despite the jacket, her body trembling with a cold that went deeper than the autumn air. Ethan adjusted his grip, trying to shield her from the wind that had begun to pick up, carrying with it the scent of coming rain. He spoke to her in low, soothing tones, more to fill the silence than because he expected answers. "You're safe now. I'm going to get you somewhere warm, okay? Someone's been looking for you, I'm sure. Your mum? Your dad?" But Maren didn't respond. Her face remained buried against his shoulder, her breathing shallow and uneven. Ethan felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name, protective instinct mixed with an old, familiar ache. Lila had wanted children. They'd talked about it in the abstract way young couples do, planning a future that felt inevitable and endless. Then the cancer came, swift and merciless, and all those dreams turned to ash. The girl's dress was torn in places, revealing scratches and bruises that painted a story of struggle. Ethan's jaw tightened as he noticed them, anger flaring in his chest. Had she run from something? Been taken? The questions piled up with no outlet, no immediate way to get answers from a child who seemed to have retreated into herself. Her feet, small and pale, hung limp over his arm, the soles caked with dried blood and forest debris. How far had she walked? The nearest road was 3 miles through dense woodland, and the closest house, his own cabin, was still a good hour's hike. He picked up his pace, ignoring the burn in his muscles and the growing ache in his arms. Every minute she spent out here was a minute too long. The fog began to lift as they descended toward lower ground, revealing patches of grey sky and the skeletal shapes of leafless alders. Ethan recognized a landmark, a lightning-struck pine that leaned at an impossible angle, its trunk split down the middle like a frozen scream. They were close to the old logging road that would take them to the ranger station. Relief washed through him, though it was tempered by the weight of the child in his arms and the unanswered questions that multiplied with every step. Maren stirred slightly, her head lifting just enough for him to catch a glimpse of her face. Her eyes were dark, almost black in the dim light, and there was something in them that unsettled him, an awareness, a depth of understanding that didn't belong to a 9-year-old. She stared at him for a long moment, then whispered, "The shadows were behind the trees." Ethan's steps faltered. What shadows? But Maren had already retreated back into herself, her face pressing against his shoulder once more. The words hung in the air, cryptic and chilling. He forced himself to keep moving, to focus on the practical task of getting her to safety rather than unraveling the meaning of her statement. But the phrase echoed in his mind, mingling with the rustle of branches overhead and the distant call of a crow. The shadows were behind the trees. What did that mean? Had she been running from someone, something, or was it the rambling of a traumatized child? Her mind fractured by whatever ordeal had left her alone in the wilderness. The logging road appeared through the thinning mist, a ribbon of gravel and mud that wound through the forest like a scar. Ethan's truck was parked at the trailhead, a battered blue Chevy that had seen better days but still ran reliably. He shifted Maren's weight, fishing his keys from his pocket with one hand while cradling her with the other. She didn't protest when he opened the passenger door and settled her onto the seat, though her hands remained clutched in the fabric of his shirt until he gently pried them loose. He wrapped a spare blanket from the back seat around her, tucking it tight against the cold that still clung to her skin. Her eyes followed his every movement, watchful and wary, as if she expected him to disappear or transform into something dangerous. Ethan met her gaze and tried to convey reassurance, though he wasn't sure he had much left to give. "We're going to the ranger station. They'll know what to do." Maren said nothing, but her fingers found the edge of the blanket and gripped it tightly, her knuckles white with tension. And as Ethan climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key, he caught a glimpse of something silver glinting against her throat. A necklace, delicate and familiar, half hidden beneath the collar of her muddy dress. He didn't recognize it consciously, not yet, but something in his chest tightened, a premonition settling over him like the fog that still clung to the trees. The ranger station sat at the junction of two dirt roads, a squat building of weathered wood and peeling green paint that looked as if it had grown out of the forest itself. Ethan pulled into the gravel lot, the truck's engine ticking as it cooled, and glanced over at Maren. She hadn't spoken during the drive, hadn't moved, except to pull the blanket tighter around her small frame. Her eyes remained fixed on the windshield, staring at something beyond the glass that only she could see. Ethan killed the engine and reached over to touch her shoulder gently. "We're here. Come on, let's get you inside." Maren flinched at the contact but didn't pull away, her body rigid with a tension that seemed to have no release. She allowed him to help her out of the truck, her bare feet touching the cold gravel with a wince. Ethan considered carrying her again, but something in her posture told him she needed to walk, needed to feel the ground beneath her even if it hurt. Inside, the station smelled of burnt coffee and old paper, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead with a faint, irritating hum. A young ranger named Tom Vasquez looked up from his desk, his expression shifting from bored indifference to sharp concern in the space of a heartbeat. "Ethan, what?" He stopped mid-sentence as he took in the sight of Maren, her torn dress and bloodied feet, the haunted look in her eyes. Tom was on his feet instantly, rounding the desk with the kind of urgency that came from training and instinct. "Jesus, is she hurt? Where did you find her?" Ethan guided Maren to a chair by the wood stove, settling her down with care before turning to Tom. "In the woods. near the old Douglas fir grove. She's been out there a while, barefoot, no coat. I don't know how long." Tom was already reaching for the radio, calling for backup and medical assistance, his voice clipped and professional, but his eyes kept darting back to Maren, trying to piece together the story her appearance told. Ethan knelt in front of the girl, his voice low and gentle. "Maren, this is Tom. He's going to help us. Can you tell us what happened? How did you get out there?" Maren's gaze shifted to Tom, then back to Ethan, as if weighing whether she could trust the newcomer. Her lips parted, and for a moment it seemed she might speak. But then her hand rose to her throat, fingers closing around something beneath the neckline of her dress. She pulled it free, a delicate silver necklace, the chain tangled and tarnished, but the pendant unmistakable. It was a small oval locket, the kind that opened to hold a photograph or a lock of hair. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He knew that necklace. He'd seen it 1,000 times, draped around Lila's neck as she moved through their home, as she laughed and cooked and danced to music only she could hear. He'd watched them lower her into the ground, with it still around her throat. Her final request, that she be buried with the jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother. The room tilted, sound receding into a distant roar as Ethan stared at the pendant in Maren's small hand. It couldn't be the same one. It was impossible. Lila's necklace was 6 feet underground in the Ashford Cemetery, entombed with her body in a casket he'd helped carry. Yet here it was, undeniably real, glinting in the harsh fluorescent light. Ethan reached out with a trembling hand, his fingers hovering over the locket without touching it, as if contact might burn him or shatter the fragile boundary between the living and the dead. "Where did you get that?" His voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. Maren's eyes met his, and in their depths he saw something ancient and sorrowful, something that didn't belong to a child. "She gave it to me," Maren said, her voice small but steady. "She told me to find you, the man who still listens to the forest." Tom stepped closer, his professional composure cracking as he picked up on the shift in Ethan's demeanor. "Ethan, what is it? Do you recognize the necklace?" But Ethan couldn't answer, couldn't tear his eyes away from the pendant. His mind raced through possibilities, each more impossible than the last. Grave robbery. But who would dig up a 3-year-old grave for a piece of jewelry with only sentimental value? A replica. But the scratches and wear were identical, down to the tiny dent on the left side where Lila had dropped it on their kitchen floor. And the engraving. Ethan's hands shook as he finally took the locket from Maren's outstretched palm, turning it over to reveal the inscription on the back. Lila Rose Hale. His wife's full name, etched in delicate script that he'd commissioned himself on their first anniversary. The room spun, oxygen suddenly scarce, his vision narrowing to that single line of text that shouldn't exist outside the grave. Maren watched him with an expression that was far too knowing for her age, her small hand returning to her lap. "She said you would understand when you saw it. She said you needed to remember." Ethan's throat closed, words dying before they could form. "Remember what?" Lila was dead. He'd held her hand as she slipped away in the hospital, felt the moment her pulse stopped beneath his fingers. He'd stood at her graveside and thrown dirt onto the casket, heard the hollow thud of earth hitting wood. There was nothing to remember, except the unbearable fact of her absence. Yet here was this child, this impossible messenger, wearing Lila's necklace and speaking words that cut through him like glass. Tom's voice broke through the fog of Ethan's shock. "Ethan, talk to me. What's going on?" But Ethan could only shake his head, his fingers closing around the locket as if he could squeeze truth from metal and chain. The door to the ranger station burst open, admitting a blast of cold air and 2 paramedics with a stretcher and medical bags. They descended on Maren with practiced efficiency, checking her vitals and examining her injuries while peppering Tom with questions. Ethan stepped back, the locket still clutched in his fist, watching as they wrapped her in thermal blankets and shone lights in her eyes. Maren endured it all with a passive silence, her gaze never leaving Ethan's face. Even as they lifted her onto the stretcher and prepared to take her to the hospital for a full evaluation, her eyes remained locked on his, conveying something urgent and unspoken. And as the paramedics wheeled her toward the door, Maren's lips moved, forming words too quiet for anyone else to hear, but meant only for him. "She's waiting for you to finish what she started." Then she was gone, disappearing into the ambulance and the grey afternoon beyond, leaving Ethan standing in the fluorescent-lit station with his dead wife's necklace burning a hole in his palm and questions that had no earthly answers. The station felt emptier after Maren's departure, the silence oppressive and heavy with unspoken implications. Tom stood by the window, watching the ambulance disappear down the road, his shoulders tense with the kind of confusion that came from witnessing something that defied explanation. Ethan remained rooted in place, the locket clutched so tightly in his hand that the metal edges dug into his palm, leaving crescents of pain that felt grounding, proof that he was still tethered to the physical world. Tom finally turned, his expression caught between concern and suspicion. "Ethan, I need you to tell me what's going on. That necklace, you recognized it. How?" Ethan wanted to speak, wanted to lay out the impossibility of what he'd just seen, but the words tangled in his throat. How could he explain that the necklace had been buried with his wife 3 years ago, that there was no rational way for a missing child to possess it, that the girl had spoken as if Lila had sent her, as if the dead could still issue instructions to the living? Tom crossed his arms, his ranger training kicking in, the need to gather facts and make sense of chaos. "Look, I know you've been through a lot. Losing Lila the way you did, I can't imagine. But if there's something about that necklace, something that connects to the girl, you need to tell me. She's a missing child, Ethan. There's going to be an investigation, police involvement. If you know anything—" Ethan cut him off, his voice raw. "It was Lila's. The necklace. I buried her with it." The words hung in the air, stark and impossible. Tom's face cycled through disbelief, pity, then a kind of wary skepticism. He'd known Ethan for years, knew him to be a solid, rational man, not given to flights of fancy or delusion. But grief did strange things to people, twisted their perceptions, made them see connections where none existed. "Ethan, are you sure? I mean, it could be a similar necklace, right? Maybe Lila had it copied, or—" Ethan held up the locket, opening it with a thumbnail to reveal the interior. Inside was a tiny photograph, faded and creased but unmistakable. Lila's face, smiling at the camera with the joy that had defined her before the illness hollowed her out. And next to it, a lock of dark hair tied with a thread, the exact shade of Lila's before the chemotherapy stole it. Tom's breath caught, his skepticism wavering. He stepped closer, peering at the photograph, and Ethan saw, the moment the ranger realized, this wasn't a replica or a coincidence. This was the original, the specific piece of jewelry that should have been moldering in a casket beneath 6 feet of Oregon soil. How is that possible? Tom's voice was barely audible, the question directed more at the universe than at Ethan. "I don't know," Ethan admitted, his own voice hollow. "But the girl, Maren, she said Lila gave it to her, told her to find me." Tom ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small office with the restless energy of a man trying to outrun his own confusion. Okay. Let's think about this rationally. Grave robbery. Someone could have dug up the casket, taken the necklace. It's horrible, but it happens. Then somehow this girl ends up with it. But even as he spoke, the explanation felt hollow, full of holes that logic couldn't patch. Ethan shook his head. Why would a grave robber give it to a lost child? And how would that child know to find me specifically? No to say the things she said? Tom had no answer, his pacing slowing as he grappled with the same impossibilities that had been tearing through Ethan's mind. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made the room feel smaller, more claustrophobic. Ethan sank into a chair, exhaustion crashing over him like a wave. He hadn't slept well in years, his nights haunted by dreams of Lila and the forest, but now the edges of his reality felt frayed, as if the membrane between what was and what couldn't be had grown dangerously thin. Tom pulled up a chair across from him, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. The police are going to want to talk to you. They'll want to know everything, where you found her, what she said, why you had that necklace. You understand that, right? Ethan nodded, though the thought of recounting the story, of subjecting himself to the scrutiny and disbelief of investigators, made his stomach churn. He knew how it would look. A widower, still grieving, finds a child in the woods wearing his dead wife's jewelry. Coincidence would be the generous interpretation. Suspicion would be the inevitable one. Tom seemed to sense his thoughts, his expression softening. I know you, Ethan. I know you didn't hurt that girl, but you're going to have to help us understand this. And that means being honest about everything, even the parts that don't make sense. Ethan met his gaze, seeing genuine concern beneath the professional facade. I am being honest. I wish I wasn't. I wish I could explain this in a way that doesn't sound insane. The radio on Tom's desk crackled to life, a dispatcher's voice cutting through the tension with updates on Maren's condition. She was stable, physically unharmed beyond superficial injuries, but unresponsive to questions. No identification, no missing persons report matching her description in the immediate area. Tom acknowledged the transmission, then turned back to Ethan. They're going to run her through the national database, check for any reports from surrounding states. In the meantime, I need you to write down everything you remember, exact location where you found her, time, anything she said, every detail. Ethan agreed, though his mind was already elsewhere, spiraling back to Lila's final days. She'd been in so much pain toward the end, the morphine barely touching the edges of her suffering, but even through the haze of medication, she'd been lucid in moments, her eyes clear and focused on him. Had she said anything strange, anything that might have hinted at this impossible connection? He remembered her last words, whispered with breath that rattled in her failing lungs. Listen to the forest, Ethan. It knows things we've forgotten. At the time, he'd thought it was the drugs talking, the poetic ramblings of a mind slipping away from the moorings of the body. But now, with Maren's voice echoing in his ears, the man who still listens to the forest, those words took on a weight they'd never carried before. Lila had been trying to tell him something, had left him a message that only now, 3 years later, was beginning to unfold. The thought terrified him, not because he disbelieved in the possibility of connection beyond death, but because believing meant confronting the fact that his grief had been incomplete, that there were truths still buried beneath the surface of his mourning. Tom handed him a pen and a yellow legal pad, and Ethan began to write, his hand moving across the page in careful, deliberate strokes, documenting the undocumentable, and knowing that no matter how precise his account, it would never be enough to explain what had happened in those mist-shrouded woods. Ethan left the ranger station as dusk settled over Ashford, the sky bruising purple and grey above the tree line. He drove without purpose at first, his truck meandering through familiar streets that felt suddenly alien. The necklace sat heavy in his pocket, a weight that had nothing to do with its physical mass and everything to do with the questions it carried. He should have gone home, should have retreated to the safety of his cabin and the solitude that had become his armor. But instead, he found himself turning toward the cemetery, drawn by a need to confirm what he already knew, that Lila's grave had not been disturbed, that the earth over her casket remained undisturbed and sacred. The iron gates stood open, the cemetery keeper long since gone for the day, leaving the grounds to the dead, and the occasional mourner who came to sit with ghosts. Ethan parked near the eastern section, where newer graves clustered beneath young maple trees that had yet to grow tall enough to offer real shade. Lila's headstone was simple, white marble with her name and dates etched in clean, elegant script. He approached slowly, his boots crunching over fallen leaves, the sound too loud in the gathering silence. The grave looked exactly as it had the last time he'd visited, undisturbed. The grass, grown over and neatly trimmed, no sign of tampering or desecration. Ethan knelt, pressing his palm against the cold stone, and felt the familiar ache of loss tighten around his ribs. "I don't understand," he whispered to the earth, to Lila, to whatever force might be listening. "How did she get your necklace? What are you trying to tell me?" The wind picked up, rustling through the maples, and for a moment he swore he heard her voice, woven into the sound, soft and familiar and impossibly close. He pulled the locket from his pocket, holding it up to catch the last rays of fading light. The metal was cold against his skin, the chain still tangled in places where it had caught on Maren's dress. Ethan opened the clasp, staring at Lila's photograph once more, at the smile that had been her signature expression before the cancer stole it away. He tried to remember the moment the photo was taken, a summer afternoon, he thought, at the lake where they used to picnic on weekends. She'd been laughing at something he'd said, her hair wild from swimming, her eyes bright with the kind of happiness that seemed indestructible. Looking at it now, he felt the full weight of her absence, the years that stretched behind him like a chasm he couldn't cross. And yet here was this necklace, impossibly returned, and with it a message that refused to be ignored. Ethan closed the locket and stood, his knees protesting the movement. He couldn't stay here, couldn't kneel at a gravestone and pretend it held answers. The real answers, if they existed, were somewhere else. Perhaps with Maren, perhaps in the forest where he'd found her, perhaps in the corners of his own memory that he'd been too afraid to explore. He thought about the girl's words again. "She's waiting for you to finish what she started." Finish what? Lila had been a teacher, passionate about literature and art, about nurturing creativity in her students. She'd loved the forest as much as he did, had spent hours walking the trails with him, pointing out plants and birds, weaving stories about the trees as if they had their own histories and secrets. But there had been no unfinished business when she died, no projects left incomplete or promises left unfulfilled. They'd said their goodbyes, painful and prolonged, and he'd let her go as gently as he could manage. Or had he? Ethan's mind snagged on that question, circling it like a wolf around wounded prey. Had he really let her go, or had he simply buried his grief so deep that he'd convinced himself it was resolution? The truth was, he'd never fully processed her death, never allowed himself to sit with the full magnitude of the loss. Instead, he'd retreated into the forest, into work, into the kind of numbness that masqueraded as healing. And maybe that was the unfinished business. Not Lila's, but his own. Maybe she'd sent Maren, or the universe had, or whatever force governed the thin places between life and death, to drag him out of the cocoon he'd wrapped himself in and force him to confront what he'd left undone. The thought was both terrifying and oddly comforting, a suggestion that his suffering had purpose, that Lila's death wasn't just random cruelty, but part of some larger pattern he couldn't yet see. Ethan returned to his truck, the cemetery fading into shadow behind him. He drove toward the hospital where they'd taken Maren, needing to see her again, to ask the questions that had been building since the moment he'd found her in the woods. The hospital loomed against the night sky, a blocky structure of concrete and glass that hummed with fluorescent efficiency. Ethan parked and made his way inside. past the tired night shift staff and the antiseptic smell that brought back too many memories of Lila's final days. He found Tom in the waiting area, nursing a cup of vending machine coffee and looking as exhausted as Ethan felt. "Any word?" Ethan asked, dropping into the chair beside him. Tom shook his head, still not talking. "The doctors say she's physically okay, just severely traumatized. They're going to keep her overnight for observation. Try to get a psych evaluation in the morning. Police are waiting to interview her, but they're not holding out hope for much." Ethan nodded, though his focus was already drifting toward the hallway that led to the pediatric ward. "I need to see her." Tom hesitated, then sighed. 5 minutes, and I'm coming with you." They walked in silence through sterile corridors, past rooms filled with the beeping of monitors and the hushed conversations of families keeping vigil. Maren's room was at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar. Ethan pushed it open to find the girl sitting upright in bed, her dark eyes fixed on the window where night pressed against the glass. She didn't turn when they entered, didn't acknowledge their presence until Ethan spoke her name. "Maren." Then she looked at him, and in the dim light of the hospital room, her face seemed older than it had in the forest, carved with shadows that didn't belong to a child. "You came," she said simply, as if she'd known he would. Ethan stepped closer, pulling a chair up beside the bed. "I need you to tell me about Lila, about how you got the necklace." Maren's gaze held his, unflinching and impossibly calm. "She found me when I was lost. Not in the woods, before, when I was somewhere else." Her voice was steady, matter of fact, as if what she was saying made perfect sense. "She told me you needed to remember the day by the water, the day you made a promise." And with those words, the floor seemed to drop out from under Ethan because he knew exactly what she meant, and he'd spent 3 years trying to forget. The memory Maren's words unlocked hit Ethan like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. The day by the water. He hadn't thought about it in years, had buried it beneath layers of grief and guilt so thick that even he'd almost convinced himself it hadn't happened. It was late summer, 2 months before Lila's diagnosis, when they'd taken a trip to the coast. They'd rented a cabin on a bluff overlooking the Pacific, spent their days walking the beach and their nights wrapped in blankets, listening to the waves crash against the rocks below. On the last evening, they'd sat on the sand as the sun set, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and red. Lila had been quiet, more introspective than usual, and when Ethan had asked her what she was thinking, she'd turned to him with an expression that was both sad and strangely hopeful. "Promise me something," she'd said, her fingers threading through his. "If anything ever happens to me, don't let it stop you from living. Don't disappear into yourself." He'd laughed it off at the time, kissing her temple and teasing her about being morbid. They were young, healthy, with decades ahead of them. The idea of anything happening to her was absurd, a shadow too distant to cast any real weight. But she'd insisted, gripping his hand tighter. "I'm serious. Ethan, promise me. Promise you'll keep going, keep building things, keep connecting with people. The world needs what you give it, even if you don't always see it." And because he loved her, because the request seemed harmless in the golden light of that evening he'd promised, he'd kissed her again and sworn that nothing would stop him, that he'd live enough for both of them if he had to. It was a promise he'd broken spectacularly in the 3 years since her death. Ethan had done the exact opposite, retreated, isolated, built walls instead of furniture, let himself become a ghost, haunting the edges of a life he no longer fully inhabited. Tom cleared his throat, breaking through the fog of Ethan's memory. "Ethan, what's she talking about?" But Ethan couldn't answer, couldn't articulate the weight of that broken promise or the shame that came with realizing how completely he'd failed. Maren watched him with eyes that seemed to see through all his defenses. her small face reflecting an understanding that no child should possess. "She said you forgot on purpose," Maren continued, her voice gentle but unwavering, "because remembering hurt too much. But she needs you to remember now. She needs you to finish the promise." Ethan's hands trembled as he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his vision blurring with tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in years. "I don't know how," he admitted, the words scraping out of him like gravel. "I don't know how to do what she asked." Maren reached out, her small hand resting on his arm with a surprising steadiness. "She said the forest knows. That's why she sent me there. You had to find me to find the way back." It was cryptic, maddeningly vague, and yet it resonated with something deep inside Ethan, a truth he'd been circling without fully grasping. The forest had always been his refuge, the place where he felt closest to Lila even after her death, but it had also become his cage, a place to hide rather than heal. Maybe that was what needed to change. Maybe the forest wasn't just a sanctuary but a teacher, and he'd been too lost in his own grief to listen to what it was trying to tell him. Tom shifted uncomfortably, clearly out of his depth, but unwilling to abandon his friend. "I don't understand what's happening here, but if you need help figuring it out, you know I'm here, right?" Ethan nodded, grateful for the support, even if he couldn't fully explain what he was grappling with. The door to the room opened, admitting a nurse who eyed them with professional suspicion. "Visiting hours are over. The patient needs rest." Ethan stood reluctantly, his gaze lingering on Maren. She met his eyes one last time, her expression conveying something wordless but profound, encouragement perhaps, or a kind of blessing. "Thank you," he said, though he wasn't sure what he was thanking her for. Maren simply nodded, settling back against the pillows as if the conversation had drained her. Ethan and Tom filed out of the room, the door clicking shut behind them, sealing her back into the sterile safety of the hospital. They walked in silence to the parking lot, the night air cold and sharp, carrying the scent of distant rain. Tom paused by his patrol truck, studying Ethan with a mixture of concern and confusion. "Whatever you're going through, don't do it alone. Call me if you need anything, okay?" Ethan promised he would, though he doubted there was much Tom could do to help navigate the territory he was about to enter. He drove home slowly, the roads winding through darkness, broken only by his headlights. The cabin appeared like a silhouette against the tree line, familiar and forlorn, a structure that had sheltered him but never truly warmed him. He parked and sat in the truck for a long moment, staring at the windows that reflected nothing but his own haunted face. Then he got out, the necklace still in his pocket, and walked not toward the cabin, but into the forest. The trees closed around him, their branches forming a canopy that blocked the stars. He moved by instinct, his feet finding the paths Lila had loved, the places where they'd walked together and talked about nothing and everything. And as he walked, he began to speak aloud, addressing her as if she could hear him, as if the forest itself was listening. "I'm sorry I broke the promise. I'm sorry I disappeared. But I'm here now, Lila. I'm listening. Tell me what I need to do." The wind answered, rustling through the leaves with a sound that might have been words or might have been his own desperate need for meaning. But as he stood there in the dark, surrounded by the living presence of the trees, Ethan felt something shift inside him, a loosening of the knot of grief that had bound him for so long. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was the beginning of something. A willingness to move forward, to honor the promise he'd made, not by forgetting Lila, but by carrying her with him in a way that didn't trap him in the past. The forest seemed to exhale around him, a collective release of breath, and for the first time in 3 years, Ethan felt a flicker of hope, not happiness, not peace, but the possibility that both might one day be within reach again. He turned back toward the cabin, the path clearer now even in the darkness, and resolved to return to the hospital in the morning. Maren had brought him a message, but he suspected she had more to tell, and he was finally ready to listen. Dawn broke cold and grey over Ashford, the light filtering through the trees in pale, watery shafts that did little to warm the air. Ethan rose with the sun, his body stiff from a night spent more in thought than sleep. He made coffee in the small kitchen of his cabin, the ritual grounding him as he prepared for the day ahead. The necklace sat on the table beside him, catching the morning light, a constant reminder of the impossible connection that had shattered his carefully constructed isolation. He drank his coffee standing by the window, watching the forest wake around him, birds calling from the branches, squirrels darting across the forest floor, the world continuing its cycles regardless of human grief or confusion. There was something comforting in that continuity, a reminder that life moved forward even when individuals got stuck in the eddies of their own pain. He dressed and drove back to the hospital, arriving just as the morning shift was settling in. The pediatric ward was quieter now, the frenetic energy of the night replaced by the subdued efficiency of routine. Ethan found Maren's room empty, the bed neatly made, and panic spiked through him until a nurse informed him that she'd been moved to a private room on another floor at the request of the police. They were preparing for a formal interview, trying to piece together her story and identify where she'd come from. Ethan followed the directions to the new room, his pulse quickening with a mix of anticipation and dread. He needed to know more. Needed to understand how this child had become the conduit for a message from his dead wife. But he also feared what additional revelations might mean for his already fragile grasp on reality. Tom was outside the room when Ethan arrived, along with a plainclothes detective named Sarah Morales. She was in her 40s, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense, the kind of person who inspired confidence through sheer competence. Tom made introductions, and Sarah studied Ethan with an intensity that made him feel like a specimen under a microscope. "Mr. Hale, I understand you're the one who found Maren in the woods. I'd like to hear your account of that in detail." Ethan recounted the story again, sticking to the facts as much as he could, though he omitted the more mystical aspects of Maren's statements. Sarah listened without interruption, jotting notes in a small leather-bound notebook, her expression giving nothing away. When he finished, she tapped her pen against the page thoughtfully. "And the necklace. You say it belonged to your late wife." Ethan nodded, pulling it from his pocket and handing it over. Sarah examined it carefully, opening the locket to reveal the photograph and lock of hair inside. "We're going to need to verify that this is indeed your wife's necklace," Sarah said, her tone professional but not unkind, "which will require exhumation of her remains." The words hit Ethan like a punch, the thought of disturbing Lila's grave viscerally repellent. But he understood the necessity, understood that without proof, his entire account sounded like the delusions of a grief-stricken man. "Do what you need to do," he said quietly, though the consent cost him more than he let show. Sarah nodded, handing the necklace back. "In the meantime, we're trying to identify Maren and figure out where she came from. So far, no missing persons reports match her description, which is unusual. A child doesn't just appear in the woods without someone looking for her. Unless, Ethan thought, she wasn't meant to be found by the usual channels. Unless her appearance had nothing to do with ordinary cause and effect. The door to Maren's room opened, and a social worker emerged, looking frazzled. "She's not responding to any of our questions. She just keeps asking for Mr. Hale." Sarah and Tom exchanged glances, and Sarah gestured for Ethan to enter. "5 minutes, and I'll be right outside." Ethan stepped into the room, finding Maren seated in a chair by the window, her legs tucked beneath her, staring out at the grey sky. She looked smaller in the daylight, more fragile, though her eyes retained that unsettling depth. Maren, Ethan said gently, pulling up a chair beside her, the police need to know where you're from. They need to help you get back to your family. Maren turned to him, her expression solemn. I don't have a family, not anymore. Lila, she's the only one who found me. Ethan's chest tightened. Where were you before the forest, before I found you? Maren hesitated, her fingers twisting in her lap. I don't remember all of it, just pieces. I was somewhere dark, somewhere I couldn't leave, and then she was there, and she told me about you. She said the forest would bring us together. It was maddening, the way her answers circled without landing on anything concrete, anything that could be verified or investigated. But Ethan sensed that Maren was telling the truth as she understood it, that whatever had happened to her existed outside the boundaries of normal experience. He reached out, taking her small hand in his, the contact grounding them both. I believe you, he said. And he did, even if he couldn't explain why. Maren's eyes glistened with tears, the first real emotion she'd shown since he'd found her. She said you would. She said you'd know how to help me finish. Finish. That word again, carrying implications Ethan was only beginning to grasp. Over the next several days, as the investigation into Maren's origins continued and came up empty, Ethan became her unofficial guardian. The state allowed it, provisionally, given the lack of alternatives and the clear bond between them. He moved her into the cabin, setting up the spare room that had been collecting dust since Lila's death. It felt strange at first, having another presence in the space he'd kept sacred to solitude. But Maren was easy company. She was quiet, observant, content to sit and watch the forest through the windows or help him with small tasks around the property. And slowly, through their conversations, Ethan began to piece together what Lila had wanted him to understand. The promise he'd made wasn't just about living, it was about connecting, about using his skills and his heart to build things that mattered. Lila had seen something in him that he'd lost sight of, a capacity for creation and community that he'd let atrophy in his grief. Maren became the catalyst for change. Through her, Ethan started reaching out to the town again, offering his carpentry skills to neighbors, volunteering at the community center Lila had loved. He built a bench for the town square in her memory, carved with her name and the dates that bracketed her too short life. And he started walking the forest trails with Maren, teaching her the names of trees and plants the way Lila had taught him, passing on the knowledge and the love of the wilderness that had defined so much of his life. The forest, he realized, did remember. It held the echoes of all who walked through it, the laughter and tears and quiet moments of revelation. And in those echoes, Ethan found not just Lila but himself, the person he'd been before grief had carved him hollow. The exhumation confirmed what he'd known. The necklace had indeed been buried with Lila, its presence around Maren's neck an impossibility that science couldn't explain, and the investigation eventually let drop as an unsolved mystery. But Ethan didn't need explanations anymore. He'd learned to live with mystery, to accept that some things existed beyond the reach of logic. What mattered was the gift Maren had brought him, the message delivered through impossible means that had pulled him out of the darkness and back into the light of living. As spring arrived and the forest burst into green life, Ethan stood at Lila's grave with Maren beside him. He placed a bouquet of wildflowers on the stone, the colors bright against the marble, and spoke aloud the words he'd been too afraid to say before. I'm keeping the promise now. I'm living again for both of us. Thank you for not letting me go. The wind moved through the cemetery, carrying the scent of pine and new growth. And in its whisper, Ethan heard what he'd been listening for all along, not goodbye, but permission to move forward, carrying the love and the lessons with him into whatever came next. And Maren, standing silent and solemn beside him, smiled for the first time since he'd found her, as if she too had found what she'd been searching for in the mist-drenched woods. A home, a purpose, and a man who finally understood that the forest remembers everything, and sometimes, when we're brave enough to listen, it gives us back what we thought was lost forever.